So, hello, everybody. Welcome to IMCW's Center for Mindful Living, the virtual version. And welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Carl Skooglund. In this class, we explore the 2,500-year-old teachings of Buddhism's early tradition, as they're recorded in what's known as the Pali Canon. They give us the best chance of these teachings give us the best chance of understanding what the Buddha himself and his early followers, thought and taught about how to lead a human life. And in order to negotiate this vast amount of material that built up over the Buddha's 45-year teaching career, we've been using a curriculum prepared by a Buddhist scholar. His name is Andrew Olensky. I hope that one thing that's become clear over the 3 years that we've been at this class is that this is not just, we don't approach it as an abstract academic exercise, simply trying to become intellectually smart about a set of ancient texts. Instead, I hope that our time together shows how these texts, with their archaic language, their dense concepts and lists upon lists, they actually mirror our lives. They mirror our own experience. And then they also lay out a path that helps us to negotiate that experience. They help us to negotiate our lives and free ourselves up in ways that maybe we didn't think we could free ourselves up about. And the Buddha said we can be ultimately free too, not just kind of free. In the last several teachings, we've found and explored versions of the Buddha's path. In both the long teaching called The Fruits of the Contemplative Life and in the relatively short teaching that we went over in the last class, the teaching called The Two Kinds of Thought, they both have a progression in which we relieve ourselves in a preliminary kind of way of what typically we find to be distressing and enchanting. And then once relieved, we come into some form of what's called samadhi, which is the Pali word for the mind becoming collected, settled, composed. And then, once collected, settled, and composed, once luminous, workable, steady, these are terms out of the texts, we're then in a position to see clearly and to incline the mind to insight. And what the Buddhist tradition would have us see clearly is what is called the conditioned nature of experience, which basically means that all this experience, it's cobbled together, it's concocted. And it being that way, it's not able to provide us with lasting, reliable satisfaction. Thus, this conditioned experience is referred to as dukkha, as unsatisfactory. But what the Buddha found is that once the mind becomes disenchanted with conditioned experience, disenchanted with dukkha, the mind is then in a position to let go of its grip. And thereby come into the unconditioned, and that is ultimate, lasting, satisfying happiness and peace. Now, we all have our smaller scale victories along the way, but there is an ultimate form of freedom, nibbana, and that's what the path would have us maintain as a possibility for ourselves. For this class, I would the teaching that I thought might be interesting and helpful for us to explore is from a collection called the Anguttara Nikaya, which is translated as the numbered collection. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the teachings are arranged into lists of ones, twos, threes, and on up. And this morning's teaching is from the book of eights. It's a teaching called the Dutiya Lokadhamma Sutta, translated as the teaching on worldly conditions. What we'll find is that the eight worldly conditions, they enchant us, they distress us. So this teaching fits into the part of the path that puts us in a position to see clearly, rather than get distressed or enchanted. And once we're relatively free of distress and enchantment, our hearts and minds are in a better position to come into samadhi, to be composed, collected, and settled. Now, just a couple days ago, I sent out Bhikkhu Sujato's translation of the Lokadhamma Sutta, which had the English intermixed with the Pali at the end. Not that this needs to be a class in Pali, but I thought it might be interesting. It's a relatively short teaching, but it packs in a lot, and it is, I think, thus justifiably one of the more frequently referred to teachings. And here's a basic outline of what we find in the teachings. And I'm going to attempt to, Emily, can you let me share my screen?
Yes.
Great. Hopefully everybody can see this well enough. So here's a basic outline that we'll find. The eight worldly conditions are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. And this teaching points out how those who are, quote unquote, both educated and uneducated, the taught and the untaught, we all encounter these conditions. The difference between the untaught person and the difference between the two is that the untaught person, or not yet taught, as we might think of it, does not consider that these conditions are impermanent, suffering, or dukkha, and perishable, or subject to change. Because the untaught person does not understand the eight conditions, the eight worldly winds, as we'll find, these conditions occupy the mind of that person. And they go on to favor, gain, praise, fame, and pleasure, and oppose loss, criticism, ill repute, and pain. And thereby they are not freed from suffering, from wandering, and from anguish. The second half of the teaching goes on and sets out the flip side of the equation, in which an educated person, so to speak, does reflect. They do reflect that these conditions are impermanent, satisfactory, and subject to change, and thus they do understand. Thus their minds are not occupied by the eight conditions. They're not filled up and concentrated on the eight conditions. And they thus do not favor and oppose the one side, and they do not favor the one side and oppose the other, and thus their minds are freed. So to break down the teaching in a little greater detail, let's first talk about the name of the sutta itself, Dutiya Lokadhamma Sutta, Dutya simply means second. It's called the second because this teaching is actually the second of two teachings that we find in this particular text. Ours is Anguttara Nikaya 8.6. 8.5 is the prior one, and it's just a little shorter. Loka means world. And it means the outer world as we know it. It also means the human population. In Buddhism, it also refers to the other realms of existence, of the various planes of existence in that particular cosmology. And it also means the world, you could say, of the five senses, which I think is an interesting one in that it points out, how do we know anything of this world other than by the five senses? Dhamma, again in the title, is a word that has many different meanings in Pali. I won't go into them all, but in our case, it means how the world of experience works, how things are, or the processes by which things come to be as they are. Now, these 8 conditions, they arise, come into being, they appear, they are produced, they present themselves to us. And as such, we often encounter the poetic translation of this sutta, that these things come and go like the wind. So the text is sometimes called the 8 worldly winds. And then finally, sutta simply means teaching, which is the Pali word, the Pali variation of the Sanskrit word sutra. So I'm going to start this morning with the very first pair of conditions, gain and loss. And just a little bit of an advance notice. I made the decision this morning not to try to get through all 8, because as I started to dig into just this first pair, it's quite a lot to take in and digest. So I think we'll try to limit it to that this morning and then pick up the rest in December. So if you could, might help to adjust your expectations accordingly. So these terms, gain and loss, they're pretty general in nature. But in the book of Fours, from this same collection, the Anguttara Nikaya, we find the following passage, which I will read now. It says, take a person who experiences loss of family, wealth, or health. Family, wealth, or health. But they reflect, the world is like that. The 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around the 8 worldly conditions: gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. But because they reflect, they do not sorrow or wail or lament, beat their breast, and they do not fall into confusion. So this passage points out the loss, the potential loss of family, wealth, and health. Now, this isn't everything that it's possible to lose, but it's still a lot, right? In terms of family, and the cycles of life, we're all familiar with it. Generations come up from the horizon, you might say, at least according to how we experience it. And then generations pass away over the horizon. Family relations can get really complicated, as we all know, and not always pleasant. But I think the assumption here is that, we're embedded within family. The coming into the world of new members can be some of our happiest moments, and the passing away of members can be some of our worst. In one text, it says something along the lines of, greater than all of the oceans of the world are the tears we've shed over our countless lives, grieving the loss of those we've loved. And we can spend more time on this later if that helps. But for now, just to say, state the obvious, this is no small thing. In terms of wealth, not all of us may think that we have wealth, so to speak, but most of us certainly do, have our collection of material possessions. And along with that goes this inclination that we want to keep our possessions, right, and not lose them. So we have things like front doors with locks on them, right? And we have security systems, and we have car alarms and bike locks, and we buy insurance, and some of us buy guns. And we assemble, we gain these possessions, which can feel good, only up to a certain point though, because then we have to worry about keeping them all safe, right? As one of the texts says, we have to keep themselves from floods, fires, kings and thieves, and from scheming heirs. In terms of the loss of health, it's not just that we get sick, although that's certainly part of it. We're also subject to injury and harm, right? In that, we can get into accidents, and, people may actually try to hurt us. To avoid losing health, we eat well, we exercise, we see the doctor, we take medicines to avoid injury. We avoid risk. And we make those calculations. And to avoid harm, we scan the environment for threats. I want to shift now to another really well-known teaching in the Buddhist tradition that helps us flesh out this theme a little more. It's the teaching referred to as the five reflections, which is also found in the Anguttara Nikaya, it being in chapter 5 of the collection. And the basic outline goes like this, and I'm paraphrasing to a great degree. The first of the first three reflections, the first three of the five are, I am of a nature to age, I am of a nature to sicken, and I am of a nature to die. Fourth, all that is dear to me is destined to change and pass away. Fifth and finally, the fifth and final reflection is, I am the owner and heir of my deeds, owner of my actions, owner of my karma. Now, on the one hand, when we hear a teaching like this, there might be the urge, if we were actually in a room together, to find the nearest exit, right? But for others of us, it might be more along the lines of, wow, somebody's giving it to me straight. And that can actually, we might even experience that as a kind of relief, in that we're looking at something squarely rather than experiencing that tension of pretending that things are not as they really are. So here are a few thoughts on this particular teaching, the teaching of the five reflections. So when we're born, we gain youth, you might say. And if we're lucky, we live long enough to experience the loss of youth. We come into middle age and to old age. At my office, we recently had an in-person pumpkin carving party. And one young colleague, he described how the faces of the pumpkins will eventually wither and sink. And as he said, get really gross. And I said, Ryan, you just described the aging process. Somebody said, speak for yourself. So this doesn't apply uniformly, but anyway, that's the point. On another occasion, this was about 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to join a men's group. And at the time, I was 38. But here's the funny thing, and that is that at one point, I calculated the average age of the 8 or so men in my group. The average age was 68. And I got so much out of being in that group. But the relevant point here is that as a middle-aged person, I got to travel to a foreign land, you might say, by becoming friends with these older men. I got to travel to a different world of experience. And just to say, I'm quite consciously using that phrase, world of experience, in that it ties into a key piece of the Buddhist framework for reality, Buddhist framework of reality, which is that when we cling to something, when we identify with something, we create certain worlds of reality, certain worlds of existence. And we occupy those worlds. The Pali word for this, for world, for this kind of world I'm describing is bhava. Some of you may recognize it as being part of dependent origination. But within these worlds, we live certain lives. We live out certain types of existence. And the Pali word for life is jati. And to apply this framework to the next reflection, I am of a nature to sicken. When we get sick, when we experience the loss of health, the tendency, not always, but the tendency is to create and get caught inside a mental world of sickness. Right? Do you know what I'm talking about? You have a fever and the world collapses, and the world is about the fever that I have, or whatever it is. We end up either because we are sick or because maybe a loved one is sick, but we create a bubble of reality. What we know of the world, the world we inhabit, it becomes defined by sickness. This is also true regarding the third reflection, death. I am of a nature to die. So we gain life, and as such, we will also experience the loss of life. And while volunteering at hospice, which I did a number of years ago, again, it was about being with people who were inhabiting a different dimension of reality. Some suffering deeply, but also others creating pockets of peace, within those worlds. The point I want to make here is to keep an eye out for this process of world making that we might engage in. Watch it arise. See, and then see if you can maintain your bearings within it, rather than get caught up, swept up, and carried away, identified with it. Keep an eye out for the coming into be of these worlds. I think it's one of the true gifts of insight from the Buddhist tradition. So those are the first three of the five reflections. The fourth is a bit of a summary. It says, all that is dear to me is destined to change and pass away. Right? It's simply saying that loss is inevitable. And one thing you might have noticed, these worlds of aging, sickness, and death, the world of loss, there's a tendency to segregate them, both physically and emotionally. Because it's not easy, at least not at first, to be around the frail and the aging, the sick and the dying. In general, it's not easy. It's not the easiest thing to be around those who have experienced loss and are grieving. It may not sound, to go on to the fifth reflection, it may not sound like much of a consolation at first. But with this fifth reflection, I think it offers us a lifeline, you might say. It's this idea, I live my life based on the actions that I take, the actions that I create. What this points to is that we have the ability to chart our own course. I want to offer up a quick story, and that is that when I was just about 8 or 9 years old, my maternal grandfather got pancreatic cancer. And according to my memory, this is how I remember it, the adults were trying to protect us kids, from this hard thing. They were trying to insulate us. But as you might expect, there's really no way that they could keep us from seeing, all of the grief and the anger and the fear and confusion that was going on, that was swirling around. There was a lot of First Noble Truth going on in that environment. A lot of dukkha, a lot of suffering. But my grandfather, we called him Mr. Ben. He said at one point, look, I'm not the first person that this has happened to. And he said that, and how you have these sort of life-changing shifts in perception? Well, his words were this sort of still, calm realization in the midst of the storm. And I still remember, how that shift felt at the time, even after so many years. My Mr. Ben, he would he was not a Buddhist in the least. But he obviously benefited from reflection. And here's a passage, from the five reflections that I think echoes his realization. It goes, a noble disciple reflects, it is not just me who is liable to aging, sickness, and death. All sentient beings are subject to these things. When a disciple reviews the subject, often the path is born in them. So I think the point of all this is that if we reflect, as the text keeps saying, it helps us avoid some of the human tendencies that can give us a really hard time. Like thinking, how could this be happening? Or thinking in particular, how could this be happening to me? Or thinking this should not be happening, or thinking this is wrong. Now, these reflections, they don't necessarily keep us from feeling the sting of loss, but they can keep us from feeling surprised when it actually does happen to us, when it happens to our loved ones. It helps us to avoid the sting of why me. So, as I said, I made the decision just this morning to give you just this much of the teaching, give you just that much to digest for now. We'll leave the other pairs for December. And in a few more moments, I'd like to pause, and check in with everybody, and then also engage in a little bit of a reflection. And I just wanted to highlight the main points of the teaching again. And that is that, we all encounter these conditions. And the teaching says that it helps us to reflect that these conditions are permanent, not able to satisfy and are subject to change. And another thing we can keep track of is how we might favor, unconsciously, kind of out of habit, favor gain, praise, fame, and pleasure, and out of habit, out of old karma, oppose loss, criticism, ill repute, and pain. And then, the final parts of the teaching is that, let's keep track of how these conditions might come to occupy our minds, take up big spaces, big amounts of mental energy and time. Let's keep track of how we might come to create particular limiting worlds of existence, worlds of identification. The last thing is that, I think the tradition offers us 4 ways, at least I can think of 4 ways that the tradition offers us as a way to relate to loss. And just first thing to say is responding to loss with grief and confusion. It's absolutely understandable. It's absolutely, natural. The question that the Buddhist tradition would have us ask, though, is, are grief, fear, and confusion, the ultimate human response? And here's where the tradition, would have us reflect. This is the first option that I spoke of. It has us reflect. It's not just me that it's happening to, that's subject to these things, right? So in doing this, we're doing our best to create and keep a sense of context, of greater context for what's happening to us in particular. And one way I've found, it's probably, I'm not uncommon in this, I'm sure, but one way of keeping, our own situation in context, I think, is seeking out the stories of people that we find to be inspiring, who face challenges and come out the other side, so to speak. For example, I've been considering reviewing some of the stories in the Buddhist collection called the Therigatha, which is what's called the verses of the nuns. And some of these nuns, they came from very, very challenging circumstances, but they went on to live the ultimate fruit of the Buddhist path. Second, we can take up what's called the task of the First Noble Truth, which is to comprehend dukkha. Comprehend dukkha, which basically means that we take time to be with to appreciate and to understand, let our hearts recognize and open to, what gives us a hard time, what gives humanity a hard time. We in this form of comprehension, we can consider, and feel our way into these questions. Where is this particular experience coming from? How did this experience come to be? And when we comprehend dukkha, it's often very natural that we transition into compassion, right? The response to encountering dukkha is very often compassion. We see suffering, and the response is to care about that suffering. This can take the form of, us caring for ourselves. It can take the form of us caring for others. It can be a general caring for, our common predicament, our common condition. The fourth thing that I can think of that the tradition, offers as a way to respond to loss, is relying on friends. We're having a tough time, and we reach out to the people who love us and want us to be happy. Just the last thing I'll wrap up with is that, I've been focusing on the sort of titanic forms of loss. But we can also sort of apply this reflection to the array of minor disappointments that we experience in life. It's just not the large scale things. It can be very small scale things too. So that is all I wanted to offer now before our questions and reflections. If you have comments or questions, guess please unmute yourself or raise your virtual hand and you'll be unmuted. Yes, Misha.
Thank you, Carl. What a wonderful talk. And I appreciate your authenticity of allowing your emotions to flow through you as you're speaking to us today. I'm really curious about if there are also ways to relate to gain. One of the thoughts that was flowing through my mind was this cultural conditioning that I have of at the relative level, a belief that gain and loss that happens in life is a result of one's karma, that kind of Americanized interpretation, that it's like, oh, what's happening in your relative world is a direct and complete reflection of where you are, in relation to ultimate reality. And so, it's kind of like a version of using karma and reincarnation to as a justification on the relative level to reinforce a caste system. Oh, you're in the unclean class. Well, you deserve it because of your karma, So I'm wondering about that part, the piece of the gain. Are there any things that speak to that piece, ways to relate to that in skillful ways?
I haven't thought about gain in that way a whole lot, honestly. I think it does, as you're saying, manifest itself sometimes. I think really that I would say that the tradition, that thing that the tradition would have us focus on is basic skillful and unskillful behavior, in the realms of, how we think, how we speak, how we act. And I do know that the Buddha said, karma is one of the hardest things to understand, maybe the hardest. So it's not really accurate to judge somebody's material possessions or material state, their state of gain, and assign that to any particular thing that they did in the past. My recollection of the teachings is that the Buddha kind of had you avoid engaging in that sort of figuring out. Yes, Deb. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Wait, I'm unmuted now. I think the idea that the world is like that applies to gain and loss and fame and disgrace and praise and blame. I mean, the world is like that. I don't think, and a friend once told me that because they were crippled, that his Catholic school nun talked about that people who were disabled because their parents had been bad. But it's not something, I was appalled when I heard that, and hoped that it wasn't pervasive, but I can't imagine thinking that. But what really got to me was your first option. It's not just me.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just me. I have loss in my life, but that is something to ponder. And I know I'm been aware of that, but today it just really hit. Thank you.
Kathleen, yes. Oh, I think you were unmuted and then muted now.
Okay, now I'm on. Okay. I just experienced the death of my daughter-in-law's mother. And she was a really good person and was really kind in terms of inviting the members of our family into their family constellation. And so we became a larger family system. But she died of prolonged cancer for a couple of years. And her sister in particular suffered greatly when Mary Rose died. And I was at Mary Rose's side when she died. And she said something to me, I was the only one there at the time. She said, I didn't expect her to pass today. I didn't think she'd die today. I thought it would be tomorrow. And at the time, that struck me as so illogical because frankly, she was in such dire circumstance by the time I saw her. She was no longer recognizable. She no longer could communicate. She had reached a state that was just this side of death already. And in your talk, it occurred to me, that wasn't about thinking she would die tomorrow. What she was really saying was, I didn't really believe she was going to die. It would be tomorrow. It would be tomorrow. And yet she couldn't have really wanted Mary Rose in her condition because that was no longer the sister that shopped with her and talked about family and all the rest. And I just want to say one other general thing, and that is that in my experience now, I've experienced quite a few deaths. it's an incredible act of generosity. And maybe it's not intentional, but it ends up being having that result. When a dying person is able to say, this is not unusual. One woman's husband said to her husband, to his wife, my friend said, Cricket, this would be a tragedy. This is not a tragedy. This would be a tragedy if one of our children were to die this way. But this is not a tragedy. This is just life. And I think that made his death so much easier for Cricket, just to present it as a given. And one final realization, a former Dharma teacher of mine worked with terminally ill people, including children. And one little 5-year-old girl, one day when Jeannie walked into the room, the little girl said, I'm going out the window today. And she died. So our thoughts that somehow children can be protected from any of this are an illusion. Yeah. So anyway, those are just comments that you kind of brought up in my mind. And I love Mr. Ben. Thank you for sharing Mr. Ben with us. I felt I knew Mr. Ben by the moment of your sweetness about remembering him. And it's really, that's an extension of what it's really all about, our memories. Bring them. They never die because we have those memories. Anyway, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Kathleen.
I have a question. My hand is up. I don't know if you see it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Carl. Good
Shlomo,
morning,
yes.
everybody.
Shlomo,
Nice to be with you. Hi. I wanted to ask you said reflection helps to avoid the sting of why me. How do you explain exactly reflection? Do you mean that the person who reflects knows that even suffering will end? Is that what you mean? That everything is going to change? Can you explain reflection? The person who reflects and the person
I think
who cannot reflect.
Yeah, the way I think the intent is that we look squarely at this reality. We reflect on it rather than turning away.
Okay.
So we take it in, and we take that in. When I taught kids, I used to use the analogy of the tin can tied to the puppy's tail, and the puppy is running away because of this clatter behind it, and it's getting scared and exhausted. But if the puppy can turn around and stop and look, the clattering stops, and it's just a relief to not run. So I think that's the kind of benefit that reflection points to, that reflection opens up as a possibility.
But in terms of the Buddhist approach, for me, it would help if I realized, okay, well, even my suffering will end, that everything is going to change. Nothing is permanent, not even my suffering. So that would be helpful. But it's more of somebody who has more enlightenment to me, inner enlightenment about their situation, rather than just looking at it squarely, because that could be frightening too.
It's helpful sometimes to take these realizations, these truths, into doses that we can metabolize, you might say, give ourselves time to absorb rather than jumping right into the deep end. So I think that's where we kind of have to be smart about what we feel like we're able to take in a healthy way.
So it's kind of dealing with things skillfully, right? Even the bad news. Yeah. I think it takes a lot of courage to face what we're dealing with. Most people have difficulty with that.
Yeah, some of us seem to be born with that courage, and some of us seem to need more of an encouragement, which is why I think the
More
teachings are
support.
so important. Yeah, yeah. That's might be an instance where friends can encourage us. If we feel like others have our back, if we're not doing this alone,
But
it's a
that
lot
helps.
easier to. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Mhm. Yes, Susan. Oh,
Hi, can you hear me now?
mhm.
Good.
Yes.
Um, wow, thank you so much for that. I'm just so glad I came. This fits very well with, I'm taking an online class with, or set up by Bhikkhu Analayo, Satipatthana Sutta.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, my leader is a wonderful teacher I met through here, Mary Aubrey, a small group.
Ah,
Yeah.
mhm.
And we just did death, and I live in Massachusetts. I've done kind of a CIMC is my home group, and we've done a lot of the 5 recollections, and it really just what everyone's talking here. It wasn't connecting, and Bhikkhu writes about how terror management theory and how the defenses of not me, not now, and it was interesting to just tap into that kind of the pushing away energy that it wasn't going deep. And it was also a little bit frustrating that it's not going deep. But kind of what you just said to the previous speaker, it takes time, gradual, to keep at it. But yeah, I just appreciate this having ongoing discussion about this. So thank you.
Yeah. Well timed then, it sounds like. Yes, Rich?
Yeah, Carl, I just wanted to make an admission that I didn't set out to be on this path today. I was actually saying to myself, well, you was on this morning, so I better get myself, together and everything. And so you showed up, and I'm really thrilled and happy that you did, because as the other people have said, it's really wonderful to hear about Ben and his, what he brought to your family, you and your family. And so anyway, you're not you, but you are really one of those persons who helps us along this path, and I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
I wanted to say I've been wrestling with a big loss of a relationship this week, and it's last 2 weeks, and it's you don't sleep well, but at least I can wake up and I think of these Buddhist reflections, and then I can get back to sleep, or start to get angry and then remember your compassion, remember those kinds of things. And when you're going through the things you can do in these circumstances and thoughts you might have, it reminded me, oh, what I've been doing is taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, I hadn't really realized I was doing that, but it kind of works out that way. If you just keep on the path, these things all fit together, and it really is can pull you through the hard times.
Yeah.
That's all I want to say.
Oh, that's great. Ralph, I think you've been at this long enough. What I just heard you describe was sort of you have this in a set of intuitions in a certain circumstance, and you realize after the fact, oh, that was the teaching, and there's sort of a really nice validation, you might say, of like, oh yeah, this is, it's it's just a trust building moment.
Yeah.
At least that's what I heard.
Yeah. There's this little, just reading a book, and somebody's talking about their teacher, and she's having real trouble, and the teacher's response is, this is dukkha. And that's the only response. But that's what that moment is, where you need to stop for a moment, and then, okay, bring in the Buddhist teachings, bring in the practice. Yeah.
Right.
But it's such a simple concept, and yet there's so much there.
Mm-hmm.
This is dukkha.
Yeah, this is what the Buddha was talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Liz. Hi.
Hi there. So I think I was in those classes when you taught the kids, because my kids were in the classes, and I have to say I got a lot out. I had, of course, forgotten, because I am aging, the story of the dog and the tin can, and I think that's the answer to the question that I was first pondering. I thought it was really well said that we get sucked into these worlds, and keep your eyes open for being pulled into those mental states. But the reality is that I think, and you can confirm that I understood this correctly, that sometimes what I think I do is I run like the dog, and feel the tin can behind me, but don't feel able to stop. And it's only when I stop and reflect that it begins to, that I can understand what the suffering is about, because there's so much forward motion.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be out of that state. The suffering is just intense. So it is the reflection, the self-awareness. So a real gift. And I think your analogies for kids worked really well for us adults. Still do.
I think maybe sometimes it's not even that we need to turn around. We just need to pause and give ourselves a moment to realize what it actually is that's happening. Might not be actually a courage moment, but just sort of a pause moment, and seeing what's happening, giving ourselves time to take in what it is. So maybe one more question before we take a little breather and engage in a meditation. Nisha?
Thanks. Yeah, I raised my hand again because it looked like everyone else had a chance. Yeah, one of the things that came up, touching back to what you had said at the beginning about, how refreshing it is to finally hear the straight stuff. That in terms of the first way of relating to grief and confusion, reflecting on the context or the larger perspective. For me, one of the things that helps, that I didn't hear specifically mentioned, not only seeking the stories of those we find inspiring, which is like the whole emphasis under the Chicken Soup for the Soul series.
Mm.
I've so often in culture encountered that used as a form of spiritual bypass to ignore the hard parts. So as a person who's had a nice helping of suffering and illness and pain and so forth, I find helpful also doses of and there are people who never get well, there are people who never find this, being able to have this is one of the things that's possible, and it's not the only thing that's possible. To kind of avoid the denial of the hard pieces of things. So I just wanted to weave that into the field today. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would like to invite us now then to take a little time to become quiet and put these teachings into practice in whatever way might be good for us right now. So to start, transition into that, as you're probably familiar, adjust your posture if you would find that helpful. Start with your physical posture, that is. Make any adjustments that you like. Maybe let your eyes close if that's comfortable for you. And the basic guidelines for the physical posture are one that's upright yet relaxed. You might also take a moment to make yourself aware of anything in your other physical surroundings, perhaps sounds, movements of air. Yes, just take some of these moments to get a comprehensive sense of your physical self, your physical surroundings. What's prominent? What sensations are prominent? What sensations might be subtle? Collect the mind, collect the attention, collect the heart around these physical sensations, this physical experience. And after maybe having come into some basic clarity about your physical posture, your physical nature, take some moments to note your mental posture. Note what the current state of your mind is. What's the current state of your heart? There is the external environment. What's the state of your internal environment? What thought patterns, what emotions, what moods might be most noticeable. And while maintaining a general sense of your external and internal environments, maintaining a comprehensive awareness within that, take a deep breath. Breathe in and feel your body. And breathe out and relax your body. Breathe in and feel your body. Breathe out and relax. And really, for the rest of this morning's meditation, 15 or 20 minutes, I invite you to keep it simple. Just do these two things. Breathe in and be clear. Breathe out and relax. Breathe in, be clear about what this present moment experience is, body and heart. Breathe out, relax the body, relax the heart. If you find that the mind is currently inclined to create and inhabit worlds of thought, just do your best to wake up out of them as quickly as you can. It's not something to give yourself a hard time about, but rather Be grateful you're coming back into clarity. Be grateful for this clarity. Be grateful for a heart that is relaxed. Breathe in, be clear. Breathe out and relax again and again. clear and relaxed, settled, composed, collected, again and again, as much as we can. I sure do appreciate being with you all this morning. Thank you all. The sun is shining, at least in DC, if that's your vicinity. Might have been a little distracting to some of us, but we're free to get out there now. I hope you can get to enjoy it. Again, it's been great being with you.